Hello again, and welcome to episode 3, where we move to an introduction of the ancient Near East. And why don't we start with an example of why it's important to take a look at the ancient Near East. If you were to look in an NIV study Bible, and I will be in this series referring to the NIV translation, the New International Version, primarily because it is the best-selling Bible in North America. And so, while it may not be the Bible that everyone reads, it is the Bible that most people purchase. And so I will be referring to it sometimes as we go through the text. Anyway, if you were to look in the NIV Study Bible, and if you were to just open up the front cover and start flipping through the introductory pages, you would not even be able to get to Genesis chapter 1 without paging through several pages that encompass a long list of ancient Near Eastern texts that the authors of the Study Bible inform the background for the passages in early Genesis. And they list not only the ancient Near Eastern texts and what they're called, but the dates that they're from and the kind of subject matter that they have. And you would see that many of these texts are older than Genesis, far older than any of the sort of traditional dates from Moses, and cover similar material. There are flood stories, creation stories, and whatnot. And then if you were to keep on flipping, you'd get to Genesis chapter 1, and the very first note on the text, the very first study note at the bottom of the page would say this: in the ancient Near East, most of the peoples had myths relating how the world came to be. Over against all those pagan myths, the author of Genesis taught a radically new doctrine of creation. The point I'm trying to make here is that in the NIV Study Bible, it's very clear that you really can't understand what early Genesis is up to if you don't first understand what the ancient Near East is up to. So let's talk about the ancient Near East for this video, and it really is important. It's crucial because the ancient Near Eastern world was what normal was at the time that Genesis was first written, first heard, first read. So, where is it? Here you can see the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see where we are here. This is the area of the world that is the ancient Near East. Sumer is the oldest civilization that was part of the constellation of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. There are written records from 3,000 years before the time of Christ, but many scholars believe that the Sumerian civilization may have gone even 1,000 years before that. So the ancient Near Eastern civilization may have gone as far back as 4,000 years before Christ, but the first written records were from 3,000 years. And you can see in fact here, as I put the timeline on the bottom, that basically this is what the ancient Near East is. It is this part of the world during this time in history. So all the different places and different cultures that are on the map right here during the time from about 3,000 years before Christ to about 500 years before Christ. That's the ancient Near East. And you can see that there are a lot of familiar names already on this map. There's Egypt down there, and here's Jerusalem. We've already talked about Jerusalem a fair bit with the Israelite national happiness graph. Also, when we talked about that Israelite story, we talked about the three major empires of Assyria and Babylon and Persia. And so all that stuff is already familiar to us, and that is this part of the world. In fact, the entire story in the Old Testament, the story of the Israelites, takes place here. Takes place on this map during this time period. Let's just go through it very, very quickly. Here, the city of Ur is where Abraham was born. And he was a boy there when his father said, "I want to move the entire household to Canaan." Now, the fastest way to get from Ur to Canaan is like this, straight across, but you could not travel straight across, as we've already discussed, because there's a massive desert in between that will kill you. And so, when Abraham's father decided to move the entire family to Canaan, the route had to be up and over the Fertile Crescent. Remember, where there is water, there is life. Where there is water, there is food. Where there is water, there is civilization, human settlement. And so this was the path from Ur to Canaan. But the Genesis text tells us that when they got to Haran, they settled there. In other words, Abraham's father said, "Hey, everybody, let's go to Canaan." They got halfway and settled there. And that's where Abraham grew up and became a man. And when he was an adult man, that's when God called him and said, "Go to a land that I will show you." And we've come to call that land the Promised Land because God promised it to Abraham. So Abraham moves to that land and does start a family, and that extended family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of Jacob's sons, they are doing pretty well until a famine occurs, and there's some troubles with Joseph, and as a result, they end up down in Egypt, as we've already discussed. At first, they're welcomed there, but eventually they fall into slavery, and that slavery goes on for 400 years. And finally, under the leadership of Moses, they make their way out of Egypt. They meander through the wilderness for 40 years, and they finally arrive back in the Promised Land, and they settle there. And they settle there for centuries. We go through the era of the judges, and then we go through the era of the kings, and then thanks to bad tax policy, the kingdom is split into two kingdoms, and then the massive three empires happen, things fall apart, and all that remains of the Israelite culture in terms of its leadership is taken to Babylon to live in exile there. And they're there in Babylon for about 70 years until the next empire says everyone can go home if they want to, and so they do. They return to Jerusalem, and it is in Jerusalem that they are rebuilding the city wall, rebuilding the temple, and that's what's happening as the Old Testament comes to a close. So really, the ancient Near East is the backdrop for the story of the Israelites in the Old Testament. That's extremely important to know, and that's why the ancient Near East is so important. It's not just backdrop. It's also, remember, default setting, culturally speaking. And that's going to be really important for us. Okay, so let's take a look at the ancient Near East. Maybe one of the first things to know about the ancient Near East, and maybe this is something that you came across way back in school in social studies classes or history classes, is that it is often called the cradle of civilization. The reason for that is that the very first examples of all sorts of things come from the ancient Near East. So the first examples on the planet that we know of agriculture, of city building, lists of laws and codes, specialization of skills and trades, so you don't have to be good at everything. You've got experts for that. Written language, astronomy, and mathematics. So far as we know, the first examples of all these things come from this time and this place. Okay, what was the ancient Near Eastern worldview? This is important because what we're going to be exploring when we explore the ancient Near Eastern worldview is, again, what I've said before. This is what normal was at the time that early Genesis was first written. So, we human beings, when we are sort of establishing a worldview, we can ask some really huge questions. Here are three of them. Who are the gods, and what are they like? I'm counting that as one question. Who are the gods, and what are they like? Where did this world come from? What is it like, and what's it for? That's the second huge question. What does it mean to be human? Why are we here? And what are we for? Notice the subject matter: God, the world, and humanity. These are huge questions. And then we human beings can ask not quite as huge questions. They're still really big, though. Things like this. What does freedom look like? And who gets it? What makes things right or wrong? What should the relationships be among people, the gods, and the world? And how should we structure our society? Okay, now, the ancient Near East explored these questions and set out answers to these questions and preserved their answers to these questions through stories. And these stories of the ancient Near East are often called the mythology of the ancient Near East. Now, I just want to warn you that mythology sometimes strikes people, especially scientifically minded people, as meaning untrue, or fiction, or made up, or just things to pass the time. But in the ancient Near East, their mythology was serious business. The ancient Near Eastern mythology was providing serious answers to these serious questions we've just listed. They weren't just pleasant diversions to pass the time. This was important. And these mythological worldview stories, that's how I think of them. I think of them as worldview stories. These worldview stories were really, in story form, a combination of all sorts of important disciplines that have been splintered out separately in our universities into things like religion, cosmology, anthropology, ethics, sociology, and political science. But that's all wrapped up in these worldview stories. And so it is serious business, and we need to approach it that way. Well, when we do, when we look at their stories, and when we explore their answers to these questions, we start to get a sense of what, as I say, normal looked like in the ancient Near East. Now, understand that there were many, many different cultures, many different cities, different languages, different religions, but they did all share a lot of commonalities, and it's those commonalities that we're going to be exploring here. We can get a picture of something that was pretty much shared by all these places that we're talking about. So let's go through the big questions. Now, I apologize that it's going to feel an awful lot like content that I'm just sort of reading off the screen, but it's actually deeply important for us to get this ancient Near Eastern normal worldview in our heads so that when we approach Genesis we can see just how different it is. So, again, I apologize, but it's extremely important. What are the gods like and what do they do? Well, one of the things that we find when we read through the ancient Near Eastern worldview stories is that the gods are very much like what we would call fallen human beings. They don't behave well, as we would say, but they are immortal, so they get to keep on behaving poorly. The gods fight, seduce, and betray each other. Their wishes change. They are fickle rulers. They sometimes demand a particular thing, and then other times prohibit that very same thing. And so this is what the gods are like. Next huge question. Where did this world come from? What is it like and what is it for? Well, the world was created by the gods for the gods. That's the first thing to know. Why? To be a place of rest. So the world was created by the gods to be a place of rest for themselves. Why did they do this? Well, they had to carve out a restful space because the world is primarily chaotic, and that chaos is represented in these worldview stories by water, primordial waters that cover the earth until the work of creation begins. But we learn chaos is still very much alive and well in the world because those primordial waters still surround the world, not only on the sides in the form of oceans, but also above and below. And we'll see that in more detail later in the series. And often there is a sort of chaos monster or chaos dragon who lives in those waters and who threatens to undermine the creative work of the gods. In other words, the gods' struggle against chaos is never finished. But this world, such as it is the only little bubble of rest from chaos. A rest that is intended only for the gods. And the third huge question, what does it mean to be human? Why are we here? And what are we for? Human beings are here because the gods were getting sick and tired of all the work that had to be done to maintain this world and the temples. The gods wanted rest, that's why the world is made. So they decided to create human beings to do the hard work, the hard labor. Humanity is a slave class. It's as simple as that. That is why we are here, and hard labor is what we are for. So those are the three huge questions. We move now to the not quite as huge, but still very big questions. What does freedom look like and who gets it? The only freedom to be found in this ancient Near Eastern worldview is the freedom of the gods, and that is a freedom to do or to take whatever you want. That's what freedom means. It's a freedom to do or take whatever you want. Obviously, everybody can't have that kind of freedom. The kings have something like it in society, because the kings are the God's representatives on earth, and we will talk a little bit more about kings later. What makes things right or wrong? Well, morality, such as it is not to be found in the character or behavior of the gods. For one thing, their character changes, their behavior changes, their wishes change, their demands change. So morality, as we're used to thinking of it, doesn't really exist in the ancient Near Eastern worldview. Instead, what you have is that the servants, the slaves, the humans, should just do what is asked and avoid what is prohibited. Now, the requests and the prohibitions will change from year to year, but appeasement is the only right behavior. We must appease our masters, we human beings. Those masters ultimately are the gods, but also the kings. If the gods do not feel appeased, then our behavior is wrong. And when our behavior is wrong, quote unquote, the gods will punish us, and that punishment will be harsh, it'll be vindictive, and sometimes we won't know we have done anything wrong until we receive the punishment. And then we realize, oops, wrong thing. Better do something else to appease the gods. So what makes things right or wrong? Right and wrong don't really exist the way we think of them, as something that's sort of eternal, but rather you just need to appease these potentially angry gods. How should we structure society? Well, civilization is the key. Remember, this is the cradle of civilization, and they were really focused on this idea of civilization. The ancient Near Eastern worldview considered civilization itself to be a gift from the gods given to us through the godlike intermediaries, and those intermediaries are the kings. Through worldview stories, and especially through the ancient Near Eastern genealogies, we can learn that the belief was that the kings descended from kind of god-human hybrids, god-men, who in turn had descended directly from the gods. And so there is an important link between the kings and the gods, as we'll see. Kingship, then, is a gift from the gods, and it is the source and preserver of civilization. Kingship, here it is again, is the primary link between humanity and the gods. Kingship establishes a structured society that allows us, human beings, to fulfill our purpose, and our purpose is to serve the gods, to appease the gods. And since the kings are linked to the gods, they have the same fickle freedom as the gods, the freedom to do or to take whatever they want. It also means that they're allowed to give out the same kind of harsh, vindictive punishment as the gods. And finally, in the king-subject relationship, we can see that there is an echo of the larger God-human relationship. And now to our last big question. What should the relationships be among people, the gods, and the world? And the key point is this. Humanity is a slave class, and the fickle gods and the fickle kings are our masters. So, in this basically hostile world, appeasement of the gods and their representatives, the kings, appeasement is the only proper work of we servant humans. It's also the best way to keep away the primordial chaos that surrounds us on every side. This, then, is the basic worldview of the people who lived in this place during the time of the Old Testament. Let's summarize. And again, remember, I'm kind of pounding this normal ancient Near Eastern worldview into your heads because without it, we can't really understand what early Genesis is doing. So what are the key points? The gods are poorly behaved, what we would call poorly behaved. The world is a bubble of protection from chaos. Humanity is a slave class. Those are the three main points about God, the world, and humanity. And so, once again, here we have it again. It's a basically hostile world. Appeasement is our work, appeasing the gods and appeasing their representatives, the kings. That appeasement keeps chaos away, but chaos is always threatening. it is on every side, above and below. This may strike you as somewhat bleak, this worldview. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that you and I have not grown up inside this worldview. Our worldview has not been shaped by the mythology of the ancient Near East. We can study it. It can be a curiosity to us. But it does not set the background or the default for our way of understanding the world. In fact, our way of understanding the world has been actually set by the worldview stories that are found by the alternate worldview stories that are found in early Genesis, as I think you'll see. And that leads us to the main ideas, the two main ideas of this video series. And the first one is this: that early Genesis actually is gospel. Remember that gospel means good news. Early Genesis proclaims good news that must have been like light into the darkness of this ancient Near Eastern worldview I've just described. And the second main idea is that good news is actually hard for us to see. We modern human beings, when I say modern, I mean 21st century scientifically minded types. And remember, we are scientifically minded compared to the ancient Near East, whether we consider ourselves scientific or not. Compared to them, we are very scientifically minded. And we have a major challenge when it comes to seeing that good news. And the way to overcome that challenge is through exegesis, the work of asking ourselves, what did it mean then and there? The work of recreating the cloud of shared assumptions that would have given early Genesis its meaning. Let's talk about these two main ideas separately. So first, early Genesis as gospel. What is the gospel proclaimed by early Genesis? What is the good news? And here is just, a spoiler for what's coming in the rest of this series. We will learn that God is a loving, gracious, forgiving provider of good things. We will learn that the world is a gift. It is good, and it can be counted on to stay that way. It is a good gift, and it will always be a good gift. There is no chaos monster lurking over the horizon, threatening this world. We will learn that human beings are not slaves, but are instead radically equal, truly free creatures. And that freedom is a different kind of freedom. It's a freedom that allows for the flourishing of all humans. It's not a freedom to do or take whatever you want that only a very few at the top get. It is a freedom that all humans get, and it should lead to the flourishing of all human beings. As a result, there should be no king tyrants in our society, treating subjects as slaves. Also, human freedom should lead to the flourishing of all creation, not just other human beings, but all creation should flourish. Okay, so here, finally, morality is grounded in the eternally good character of God. God's goodness does not change, and in fact, God's expectations for us are known and unchanging. So we don't have to live with the anxiety that what God wants might change tomorrow, and then we might get zapped, and we won't know why. So here is the gospel according to early Genesis. You can see how good this is, and how much more like what we want the world to be like this is compared to the ancient Near Eastern normal worldview. So that's the gospel of early Genesis, but there is a huge challenge that we face in trying to get ourselves to see that gospel. And we can represent this challenge, in one way we can represent this big challenge is through this table here. So I'm going to put on the left what I'm calling our primary concerns, and on the right, their primary concerns. When I say our on the left, I mean, again, we 21st century, basically scientifically motivated people. When I say their primary concerns on the right, I mean not just the ancient Near Eastern primary concerns, but specifically the Israelite primary concerns within that ancient Near Eastern context. Okay, let's go down ours on the left. When we read something from ancient literature, especially something that seems to be describing events, we're going to ask ourselves these questions. What happened exactly? When exactly? In what order exactly? Where exactly? and how exactly. Now, I don't want to make light of something that is truly a disorder, but please understand me when I say that people from the ancient Near East would have looked at our primary questions on the left and would have wondered if, as an entire society, we had developed something like obsessive-compulsive disorder, where all we can look for are facts, individual facts, and that's what we're seeking for, individual facts, and then we need to line them up. We need to find out what happened exactly, when, in what order, and just line them all up so that we understand what happened. But the ancient Near Eastern people, and therefore the Israelite people, had very, very different primary concerns. They had questions like the ones we've already seen. What is God like? What is the world for? What are people for? What should the relationships be among God, people, and the world? What is freedom, and who has it? How should we organize ourselves? And what makes things right and wrong? Those were their primary concerns. And the reason why this is a big challenge is because, let's say, we'll just put a box at the bottom there, and we'll put inside that box any passage from early Genesis. So, as an example, let's put the flood narrative in there. Well, the way we approach the flood narrative and the kinds of questions we ask are so different from the way the early Israelites were approaching the flood narrative and the kinds of things that they were asking. And we can't help ourselves having this column on the left, but it's just so different. For example, when we read the flood narrative, if we don't stop and remind ourselves that this is ancient literature that comes from a different context with a different set of cloud of shared assumptions, if we don't stop and think about those things, we find ourselves asking questions like, where did all that water come from? And then where did it go afterwards? Was it salt water or was it fresh water? And, from a find all the facts and line them up perspective, this is a significant question. If you read through the flood narrative, as we will, but if you read through it, people are accustomed to thinking about 40 days and 40 nights. But that just describes how long the rainfall was. Not just rainfall, but floods coming out of the heavens and floods coming out of the earth. But in terms of how long everyone was in the ark, it was a year. So the earth was submerged for a year. So it's actually kind of important to ask, was that salt water or fresh water? If you are thinking as we think, scientifically, find the facts, line them up. Because if it was salt water, how did the freshwater fish live for a year, and vice versa? We asked things like, could all those animals really fit on the ark? One boat, honestly? One boat for all the animals that were alive on the earth? Remember, what that story says is that the water covered all the mountains on the earth. So that means the entire globe was covered in water, and the only living animals were in one boat. Is that possible, we ask? And as long as we're thinking about the only living animals being on a boat, and if that boat landed on a mountain somewhere near what we call Turkey, how in the world could kangaroos get to Australia? These are the kinds of questions that might pop into our head if we read the flood narrative unguarded and let our modern sensibilities just sort of take over. But the way the Israelites were approaching the flood narrative was extremely different. Their primary concerns were things like, what is the character of God? What is God's response to our human sinfulness? And will the world ever be uncreated by the powers of chaos? Remember, those floodwaters represent chaos in the ancient Near East. So a flood was an uncreation. And will the world ever be uncreated by the powers of chaos? In other words, this is just another way of asking, is chaos looming just over the horizon? Is it possible? Well, these are extremely different ways of approaching the flood narrative. Remember, the way we explore our primary concerns is through modern science and modern history. And those are disciplines that are very, very good at discovering facts, lining them up, and answering the questions, what happened exactly, when exactly, how exactly, in what order exactly, and these sorts of things. But their primary concerns were explored through worldview stories. And so when you put something like the flood narrative down here, just think how different that is. To explore the flood narrative through modern science and modern history is not anything like exploring the flood narrative through the idea of worldview stories and the kinds of questions that those stories address. Well, our work as we do the work of exegesis is, the reason exegesis is needed to come to our rescue is that what we have to do, remember that flood narrative in the box there at the bottom, that is not our flood narrative, that is their flood narrative. So our first work when we do exegesis is to set aside our primary concerns. We have to try to set aside those scientific, almost obsessive-compulsive disorder kinds of questions about the flood narrative, and we need to approach the flood narrative as best we can through their primary concerns. In other words, we need to do the work to recreate the cloud of shared assumptions and hear the flood narrative as it was meant to be heard. Ask ourselves what was intended to be proclaimed by this flood narrative as best we can. And the idea of this series is that once we do that work, the work of exegesis, the work of recreating the cloud of shared assumptions, we will find that not only in the flood narrative, but in all the other passages in early Genesis, we're going to find things like the gospel that I've already listed here, the gospel according to early Genesis, that God is loving, that the world is a good gift, that there is no threat from a chaos monster, that we are not slaves, but instead are all equal humans that all deserve to flourish, that morality is based in God's good character, and that God will stay put, as it were. God's expectations are known and unchanging. That is what we're going to find as we work our way through early Genesis in the context of the quote-unquote normal ancient Near Eastern worldview. We're going to see that early Genesis is proclaiming something radically different. And we will begin the work of looking at early Genesis with the next video, where we finally get down into the details of the text of early Genesis. I'm looking forward to traveling through early Genesis with you. Until next time, bye for now.